Hey everyone, I'm Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. So, moving on from our episode that we just finished on the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, and the Catholic Church, we are moving on now to the British Empire and how it was able to keep the peace in Europe. Even places outside of its own control, like how it was able to kind of balance Europe off to where it was able to keep the peace while also looking at um, we will talk about this to a more limited extent because Europe is just so interesting in how they were able to make it work. But we might also at this point at this episode talk about how the British were able to keep the peace outside of Europe and kind of play play the local populations up against each other to where the British were able to be their own peacekeeping authority. India is a great example. But you know, um, getting right into it, when we look at the British peacekeeping power, we're looking mainly at the Pax Britannia. But before we get to the Pax Britannia, there is a fascinating story before that. The Pax Britannia started at the very end of the Napoleonic Wars. And there's a reason for that. Because the French Revolution was such a threat to the conservative, absolutist, like often absolutist political power that kings and emperors had over their people. And therefore, the ideas behind absolutism and behind like feudalism and like behind royalism um, the French Revolution was such a threat to all of that. And so the status quo in the way and how these big empires were able to maintain their control and kind of the integrity of Europe in those states, the way and how society at that time was known to have ran that was all in jeopardy with the French Revolution. And, we hear about that in history class, but we don't know to what extent because often our teachers may not give us primary source accounts. We may not hear from the people at the time just how much of a threat it was seen as being. What if I told you that after the French Revolution, as much as we hear about the reign of terror within France, what if I told you that after the French Revolution, at the almost immediately afterward, after the king was killed um, in France, just across the border from France into the Holy Roman Empire, under Habsburg control, as well as within other places around Europe, they started they started bringing in essentially what was secret police to their people to sort of listen in on what the people were thinking to see if they supported the policies of the French at the time they were talking about liberalism and freedom and equality. They were scared as shit because as a king and as an emperor, you're going to think my people don't want me in this position, so that if there's a revolution that actually gets the interest of the people as being the primary concern, as a king and emperor, you are going to be very scared of your own people very suddenly. So that's why, with our first primary source, we are going to look at how Emperor Francis II um, he sent over secret instructions to his officials within his territories of Austria and Bohemia being modern day Czech Republic, on the preventative measures for maintenance of civil peace and order. This was sent over to his officials in February of 1793. Very, very soon, only a few months after Marie Antoinette and King and after the French king was killed. And so the gist of it is that Austria and the Holy Roman Empire as a whole, and the leader of both two of those being Francis II, was terrified of French revolutionary ideals. And so he began to censor the people with police state activity. He also enforced the clamping down of press releases and any information about the French only hearing about a a a a bad take of the French as being like violent and disruptive and not keeping the peace. You know, they purposefully gave information about the reign of terror rather than the good things that came from the revolution, like the document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And so they strictly censored anything positive of the French Revolution. They made it illegal to meet um, to meet in secret with anybody. They also yeah, like Francis the
Yeah,
Second response to the French Revolution was a really good example of how Europe was terrified of the revolution itself.
yeah. Well, essentially, what you have here is the threat that liberalism poses to any sort of empire, any sort of kingdom that has a king that claims to claim their authority from God and cannot be judged or, deposed by anyone else outside of that system. With the liberalism, you come up with these ideas of rights that every citizen has, regardless of their social status. These ideas of freedoms that the government can't impinge upon. Something that if you're in control of a kingdom or an empire that has total control of just about everything, it seems a little threatening that this whole idea of your citizens having rights is something that's going to terrify you. Absolutely. Um, and so, uh, let's see. We could go a little into some of the detail of what we had in Emperor Francis, his instructions to those to his officials in those areas. And here we have a quote here, a quote, since His Majesty has no greater concern than to apply all beneficial means toward maximizing to maintaining the peace, safety, and prosperity of his subjects, by contrast, eliminating anything that may relate to the spread of unbridled and pernicious attitudes and principles prevailing in France, His Majesty has deigned to command that the provincial authorities shall once again be involved emphatically in, and one of the aspects of this was, quote, permitting no secret meetings under whatever pretext and punishing persons acting contrary to this rule, end quote. So again, going back to that analysis of this, so no secret meetings, no meetings of essentially anything can be had without, say, approval or authority or overseeing of the government. That's how threatened they were. Any sort of information that could be spread with like throughout the country by its citizens at this time could have been seen as threatening. They could be talking about the French. They could be talking about freedom, about organizing, about unions. Anything of that sort is threatening to any sort of empire that wants to keep its claim of unbridled, unquestionable authority when people are getting these ideas of their head that, maybe they have rights and values that the government shouldn't, impede upon those. Another part of the was it of Emperor Francis his his decree to his authorities was to keep a watchful eye on French immigrants who were coming into the country because one that they didn't trust the French themselves and they didn't trust the ideas that the French might be rolling on in secret meetings or whatever that they may be having. They might be discussing these ideas of freedom and liberty and anything that would be threatening to the state. And so it's in the state's interest in this case to clamp down on any sources of information that could threaten them. Um, yeah. With that, Khalil, do you want to chime in with anything?
Oh yeah, just like this document, this primary source is rather it's not as long as a lot of primary sources tend to be. Like for example, if you look at a treaty that ends a war, it might be multiple pages long. Like the Treaty of Versailles is like 200 pages long. It's crazy. But now but this one it's very short. And I'm almost tempted to read off the entire thing. But another section of it is quote strictly ensuring by any means of censorship that there is no domestic printing, reprinting, or importing of such books that give a favorable account of the French Revolution. or deal with such changes of state and principles that run counter to the principles of a well established monarchy. End quote. So again, you might listening, if you're listening carefully to history class, be thinking, well, now wait a minute. Um, like as a king or an emperor at the time, you must be very scared of the French Revolution because they undermine your power. They think of the idea that there can't be a king. A lot of history teachers they bring this up, but they don't often show you how scared they really were. I mean, you have to be very scared as a ruler to send your authorities that were just originally like sent out to govern territories, bring taxes to the central government to enrich yourself. But you have to be very insecure about your power to send out secret police to enforce no printings of certain things that support the French Revolution. That means that you have to, as a censor, then look at every printing coming out of your governing territory, every single printing press. You have to be checking that shit to see if they're saying anything that to the average person would make it seem like they're supporting the French Revolution because they don't want revolt themselves. Like, like as a if you're Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, you're looking at the popular revolt that took place in Paris and how suddenly, at one moment, spontaneously, the people just erupted. That is terrifying. And so that means that you're taking all these measures that you wouldn't normally take to watch your people. When before it might have been about religion with the 30 Years' War or about some outside force coming in to take over the country or some general revolt against a particular king in place of another king. This was about the idea of kings in general. And this is at a time in Europe when they're looking over at the Americans and they're thinking, oh, democracy, we don't know how well that can last. We don't know how long that can last. And really, up until the end of the Civil War, does like most European states, they're looking at America and their practice of democracy, of representative democracy, and they're thinking that system's eventually going to fall. That's actually part of the reason why they look at the Civil War and they're like, see, you give them too much freedom, and they start talking about their freedom to own people. Now you have a civil war going on about that. See, democracy is so brittle. And so there is no conception in the European understanding at the time of governing a territory, of governing a people that is not absolutist monarchy. And so when you have the French Revolution, which at the time was going through the reign of terror, you are terrified because it isn't just about you. You're thinking this is the end of humanity. This is the end of organized authority. We were talking about in Peace v. Freedom about how like anarchy is the downfall of civilization, about like all the things that you lose without a government. If you're a leader at the time, you're thinking about the French Revolution in those terms.
Yeah, because that's really the only alternative that they could see. Because at the time, the only other democracy or attempting democracy at the time is America, and they had just formed what 10 barely 10 years ago, just ratified the Constitution a year or so ago. So it's not much to be viewing on the other side of this argument is that with every human and their human rights and their freedoms, that they're just going to tear the world apart. So for the rulers of monarchies, throughout the monarchies of Europe, this was an existential crisis. Um, Another source that we'd like to look at that really exemplifies what these leaders were really fearful of was a writing by Frederick Cotta. He was writing about on the Constitution of France in 1793, and he really explains the sort of Avengers level threat that these monarchies would be looking at, and describing freedom, rights, uh, of what was basically going on in France. And so some excerpt from this article were some things including, quote, in France, all people are free. Thus, there are no bondmen there. Moreover, no man is the master of another. And even the employer can demand from the domestic or servant in matters of service only to what had been arranged upon in the service contract. In France, all people are equal in rights. Thus, the son of a farmer can, if he is qualified, become a minister or an archbishop, just as well as the son of a king. Whereas in many other countries, one cannot get such a post if one is not of ancient high noble, ducal, or princely blood, whatever they call it. Also, in France, a so-called nobleman or count has no preference on whatsoever on the craftsman of other this birth. End quote. So again, this is really just outlining the the existential threat, the Avengers level threat that what they see here is what the monarchies see here is an existential level threat because the people would have the ability to have freedom, to have rights, and demand what they want wherever they want it. And to a king, that's your worst nightmare.
According to Friedrich Cotta in this source titled On the Constitution in France in 1793, he he isn't necessarily forcing the people to support in revolution against the state. That's part of the interesting thing about liberal revolutions is that you don't need to. All he intended to do was to educate the people on what the French Revolution advocated for, that ran contrary to the censorship and manipulation tactics that Francis II was attempting to do within Central Europe under his territory as being the King of Austria and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. It ran contrary to the censorship policies at the time. All he intended to do was to educate the German people or the Austrian people or whatever people, Central European people or European people in general, on what the French Revolution advocated for and whether or not they wanted it. And the thing is, considering the way and how he portrayed it, which interestingly enough wasn't necessarily false, you have to assume that the average person probably did support the French Revolution. Because if you are hearing in plain language in France, all people are free. In France, all people are equal in rights. In France, um, um, like if the entire um like source is saying that in France people are free, the people, there is no master or slave, or there is no master or serf in this system, then it's very it's very appealing. It's hard to imagine a peasant thinking, "Oh no, this is scary. I don't want to be free." No, no, they probably do, unless they're gobbling up the propaganda from the emperors and kings of the time, which is saying that, "Oh, look at the reign of terror. This is not what you want. This is not the freedom that you want. It's just the disruption to the peace." But it's interestingly enough, like the way and how like like a sort of battle of the mind was going on within the average like Central European person, because you're hearing from your king and emperor, no, this is dangerous. You do not want these things. And then you hear someone else saying, hey, I don't want to force you to believe what you want, unlike the king and emperor. I'm just telling you that the people in France, at least they're free. So
Exactly. And so what you have here is in reaction while the governments and the monarchies are starting to begin more clamping down on any real information, any discourse surrounding France and the idea of liberalism, you have more people throughout Europe starting to, get behind this whole idea of freedom, of equality, of, individual rights. Um, and you have more examples of individual citizens or authors or writers who would go on and simply say what they thought about ideas of freedom and liberty while trying to um, kind of stay in between the lines of the persecution and the censorship that these monarchies were trying to impose upon them. So another example we have here is Conrad Osner in his 1794 article of What May Be Hoped for from Freedom, in which, for fear of prosecution again, he indirectly refers to ideas of the French Revolution in promoting his own love of liberty and individual rights and freedom. And so, a little quote from his article here is a quote, I love liberty because I love contentness. No longer will anyone step onto the back of anyone else because of his birth. All will walk upright. No one will be compelled to crawl anymore. One will be able to converse about everything that concerns our interests without holding back, to speak, write, and act more boldly. Our mind will enrich itself in a manifold of ways. Our way of thinking will become enlarged and emboldened. End quote. So again, you have someone in power in a newspaper who's simply saying what they think about this whole idea of freedom and liberty. If you were to say anything about the French, if he was to say, I love the idea, I love the French Revolution, they did great, we should do this here. I don't think we'd be seeing any more newspaper articles from this Osler guy. Um, in trying to skant around these sort of basically these walls that the monarchies were trying to put up everywhere, and especially after the French Revolution, we had a lot more people simply just saying what they thought. And by simply spreading information, which is one of the strengths of liberalism, and having a freedom of press or freedom of idea, is that you could say your opinion, and with information itself, as much as you want to try to stop it, it's hard to really eradicate information, especially if it's within the human mind. Someone was to read this, they might agree with it. And that's not really a belief, especially a belief as, tangible, as, as likable as something as freedom and liberalism. That's not really something you're going to get out of someone's head. And by simply spreading this information and keeping it outside the ideas of the French Revolution, in explicitly mentioning the French Revolution, you could simply just spread this idea of liberalism and maybe some people will get behind it. And, they continue to do so.
Right. And as we move from Osner, we also we move to a very interesting time right after the French Revolution in Germany, when sections of modern day Germany, like the Rhineland, the people along the River Meuse, and Western Germany, they decided to declare sovereignty and secede from the Holy Roman Empire, and join France in their republican, like revolutionary system. And this is a big deal just because, like it may sound like a big deal, but like if you're not already thinking this, this is this is big because this assumes that this not only like degrades the Holy Roman Empire as a territorial like system, it also um it also brings up the idea that the revolution in France didn't need to be confined to France, because the ideals of that revolution in France, it applied to other places far beyond the France's borders. And how, as a king and as an emperor, you got to be looking at your fellow kings and emperors, despite of how many wars you might have gone and had between each other over the centuries. um, you have to unite between each other again, under the common banner of being a monarch, to fight against this threat, because this is not just something happening in France. It's not going to stay in France. The people, whether they be just across the border or whether they be across the continent, they will join up on a united front to create some new model of society that you are not in. So, um, an excerpt from this quote is that the people between the Meuse, the Rhine, and the Moselle are united in order to secure their political independence with the French people, and they incorporate their territory into that of the French Republic, which, after it has subdued the kings, will make known its decisions. The union with the German Reich is abolished forever. The people of these territories will never deny their most sincerely brotherly love for the German people, regardless of how much they separate themselves from them, and will seek to carefully maintain the relations between Germany and the French Republic. All military, administrative, and judicial authority stemming from the former princes of the old order, whatever name it may carry, is eliminated. Nobles, titles, orders of social distinction, general and special privileges, exemptions, feudal rights, seigneurial dues, tithes of every kind, etc., as well as all institutions that bring about the inequality among people's social ranks are and remain abolished. End quote. So this is a big moment because they're fighting against an idea, the same idea that might be going on in Sweden, the same idea that might be going on in England, the same idea that might be going on in modern day Ukraine or Russia, the same idea that might be going on in Spain, the same idea that might be going on in Italy. This is a rather universal idea, at least in the European understanding, because like again, as I mentioned, this is bigger than just France. This is something that like the things that the French were fighting for against their king could apply to far beyond their borders. And so, as you see with the people in this Western German territory, they didn't want to just create their own independent state and be like free and independent there and get rid of their like old feudal ties. They wanted to join France because they saw what the France was doing and they're like this idea isn't just aligned along like nationalist views of France because you know this is something that we might have to explain later, but nationalism wasn't the same as it is like perceived today. So the revolution in France did not carry some sort of French identity to it. It was more along human rights. And so the German peoples, they did say like, oh, we have like our ties to the German people, but we also want to be part of this free state, you know, just as much as any other people in Europe would if they had the opportunity to. So, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, with what we have here is empires really trying to fight against an idea. An empire is supposed to fight against another empire. An idea is what the French Revolution brought. It didn't simply just bring in a new leader or a new military or some other sort of physical way that they could influence throughout of Europe. It's not just another Napoleon or something like that. It's a new it's a new idea, and it's an idea that would get sympathy throughout the world. It's an idea that threatened everything that a monarchy and everything that a king or queen or any sort of appointed or supported leader to that effect. It's an idea that would destroy any concept of like this at all. One idea that we always bring up, we've brought it back up in Peace v. Freedom, was the idea that a thought has no borders. When it comes to the idea of liberalism, it's not something that's simply closing the borders or not letting in French immigrants could stop. Once that idea is made and spread, it's not going to stop. People will forever meet and discuss the ideas of what if they had freedom, what if they had rights, individual, you know, things that can't be infringed upon by the government. Once that idea is out there, it's not going to come back. And as long as that idea is out there, every empire, every monarchy is at threat because the idea of human freedom, human unity, through that universal freedom that liberalism says that he has, that's always going to be there, and that's going to be in the hearts of the people that these empires seek to oppress. That's not really something. No secret order or attempt at censorship could really fully clamp down on that idea, which is something that, as we've described in this episode, was so threatening to every monarchy because you can't really stop an idea. It's not just going to stay in France, it's going to be everywhere.
right. So one thing that needs to be pointed out in some is that an empire is meant to fight an army of soldiers, whether they come from a an armed revolt on the inside, or or in or an army from the outside. It's not meant to fight an army of the people or an army of the masses or an army of the elderly, an army of the women, an army of the children. They're not meant to fight those people, so they have to use like way different like um tools for surveillance that they weren't used to using, at least at that level. They when beforehand, um anti-liberal policies were more or less just making sure it was authoritative. It was more or less like they needed to have control over whether or not you gave taxes to the state, or give lip service to the king. It wasn't so much based on a total idea, but that's kind of the problem with these empires, is that like while the Catholic Empire ended very slowly in Europe, arguably ended around 1600s. It was around the French Revolution that the Catholic Empire really fell, because um, because France used to be a Catholic country. It was one of the last ones to really cast off its yoke. But then also, the reason why I mention it is because even though it wasn't the Pope directing a lot of this, it was more or less like the authority of religion in cementing political power. These kings, they would say they had the divine right to rule. Um, and the people, the French people in this case, they knew that was bullshit. And so when they revolted, they cut off all tithes to their nearby churches. They cast off the church, and then they even had this new brand of Christianity, and where they wouldn't worship God, they would worship this being called the Supreme Being. So it was a very big thing that was going on, that was taking place. The religious ties that came with in trying to legitimize monarchy, they were failing. And there is this idea in the post-revolutionary time in the 1790s, before Napoleon came to take over France, that the that all kings and emperors are in a plot against the people, that there should be no borders in response to this, and that it should be run by Republican administration, consent of the governed, a bunch of enlightened principles, but practiced together. Not just it's going to be a practicing idea of all the written down ideas, whether it be by Smith or Locke or Hobbes or Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, like all those people, their ideas were going to be practiced in real life. That's why Georg Forster, in his On the Relationship of the People of Minds, the Franks, um, in November 1792, he voiced very clearly this sort of conspiracy against the people. And it is a little redundant, but the way he very exclusively and very specifically talks about how, like, the princes, the kings, the emperors, it was part of some plan against the people. And that's why you can see that really like show and prove itself in the way in how they were censoring the people outside of France in response to the French Revolution. Because Georg Forster, he says, quote, up to now it was the prince's clever politics to carefully separate the peoples from each other. So he's talking about the idea that people were trained to hate people from the other side of the border, that cultures would be developed distinguished from people on the other side of some border, that there would be no unity of mankind as long as there were kings and emperors, because the state, according to Forster, was seen as a bourgeois concept that um, that was established by the kings and emperors to maintain their own power, that it wasn't done in the interest of the people, or it was also not even done in the interests of reason. According to Forster, it makes no sense to believe that all men aren't brothers. because to him it makes sense to believe that they are. So another quote: the same guild that pretends to have special calling to teach incited these brothers against each other, and the brothers being people across borders, because their corrupt and hardened hearts recognize no brother. So, so yeah, you just have this idea that nationalism, that fact that the idea that if you're in France, you should hate people in Germany, or that if you're in England, you should hate people from Germany or France, or if you're Russia and you should hate people from Austria. It's all a bourgeois concept, and it was part of the prince's clever politics to separate the people.
Exactly. As you said, essentially we were trained to hate people across our borders, even though we had more in common with them. Um, just at the end of the day, it comes back to the idea that, once again, a thought has no borders. The idea that we all have rights, that we all have individual freedoms, is something that everyone shares, regardless of what side of the line on the map they're drawn. Another quote related to this is, quote, our language of different what's our concepts also be, end quote, also by the author. Um, which just comes back to the idea of that we as mankind, we have these universal things that we all share. We have these ideas of freedom. We have these ideas of rights. We have these things that we hold and do not want to be taken, for granted by whatever government that we, through our power as individuals, as people, grant the power to the government in order to govern over us. It's our power that puts those people in power, not the anointed power, not the anointed, guidance of whichever god or religion is, that of the king. It's these universal ideas, these concepts, these thoughts, this idea of liberalism that brings mankind together no matter what side of a border or what empire you just happen to reside into. And again, this is what threatened empires, this is what threatened monarchies and kings so much. And so, as we wrap this one up, we'll be talking more about the British Empire and talking about more about the other powers in Europe as they try to not just react to this, but set upon their own way in which the states that would eventually spring up would start to, relate to themselves.
Yeah, I think I can wrap this up. And basically just saying that this episode was talking about the threat that was posed to conservative royal authority, not just in Britain, but around the continent. And so as we go into the next episode, which will be released hopefully 5 days after this one, we will talk about how the British would implement policies throughout the continent that would reinforce that control after Napoleon fell. So yeah, we will be talking about that next time, but this time we were just talking about the threat that was posed to conservative authority. And conservative authority is one thing that we will make clear in the next episode is that we talk about all this, we talk about all these ideas because it benefited Britain to have a stable Europe so that it could maintain its own colonial imperial authority across the world. It didn't want to put so much military focus or political focus on keeping the continent from going into massive war like how it did with Napoleon, and it just wanted to be able to run its empire and enrich itself. And it was the Congress of Vienna, which we'll talk about in the next episode, that was very effective at doing that. But before that, of course, you had a lot of this. The reason why the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars would be so big, it was because of this threat. So anyway, we'll get back to that next time. But for now, we are the Marshals of Truth. I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you next time.